is a non-profit organization dedicated to lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable government. We're non-partisan, and we don't take a dime of money from the government, and we never will. Now, a few weeks ago, I was sitting at my desk in Vancouver, typing up an op-ed about this government's reckless spending and debt burden that is crushing British Columbia, when my phone rang. It was Angelo Isidoro, Executive Director of the BC Conservatives. I picked up and he said, "Carson, I love the work you do with the Taxpayers Federation. I'd love to have you up to Nanaimo to speak to our convention. But before I do, I've got a very important question for you. Carson," he asked, "do you support free speech?" Now I was taken aback. Free speech, I said. "Angelo, that's what allows me to hold this government's feet to the fire every single day. It is the foundation of our democracy. Of course I support free speech." And without missing a beat, he said, "Great, how would you like to come up to Nanaimo to give one?" So that's what led me here. He's a smart guy, that Angelo.
That's so funny.
Now friends, as British Columbians, we have an important decision to make. We need to choose the direction that our province is going. And friends, there are only two options before us. There is poverty or there's prosperity. We can choose affordable homes, or we can choose a government that's crushed the dream of home ownership for a generation. We can choose powerful paychecks for you, or big bonuses for a bloated bureaucracy in Victoria. We can choose more money in our pockets, or more money in the pockets of politicians and big union bosses. Friends, we can choose prosperity, and here's how we do it. We cut taxes, we end wasteful spending, and we bring back accountable government. Because a decade ago, a family could afford a home of their own in Saanich or Surrey on one paycheck. Today, even with two paychecks, those same homes are out of reach for families in our province. We cannot afford to stay on this road. We cannot afford to keep choosing poverty over prosperity. Because as I stand here today, 1 in 5 British Columbians are food insecure. That means they're lining up at food banks or laying awake at night wondering how they'll be able to feed their kids tomorrow or next week when the bills are due. Emergency rooms from Tawasin to Delta to Kitimat and Williams Lake are closing through the night, leaving our loved ones in the lurch to die at the hands of this government's healthcare system. And meanwhile, our provincial debt has grown by more than $26 billion over the course of just 1 year, from $104 billion last year to $130 billion today. That means that the money we owe as a province is increasing by $500 million per week. Every dime of that is money that you, your children, and their children will be paying back with interest for decades. And if we as British Columbians are being buried by government debt, we are being crushed by the interest charges on that debt. Because just like with your family's credit card or line of credit, big debt today means even bigger interest payments tomorrow. Debt interest cost British Columbian taxpayers $4.3 billion over the last year alone, which is about $800 for every man, woman, and child in this province. Over the next 3 budget cycles, British Columbians are expected to spend more than $15 billion on provincial debt interest charges. That's as much money as the province is collecting in personal income taxes this year. That money is going straight from your paychecks to the big banks that own British Columbia's debt. Next year, debt interest will cost us more than $5 billion. That is more money than the province collects in the carbon tax and motor fuels tax combined. It is enough money to build 150 new schools with space for 98,000 students, or to hire 75,000 new school teachers in this province. And all of that borrowing is fueling a massive bureaucracy that we don't need and we can't afford. The bureaucracy had 38,914 employees in 2021, which cost us as taxpayers $3.3 billion. That has now ballooned to more than 47,156 bureaucrats at a cost of $4.6 billion. These numbers, they're just for the core bureaucracy, paper pushers in Victoria. It doesn't include the British Columbians who work at universities, schools, hospitals, civic governments, and crown corporations. The cost of that bureaucracy has grown by 40% since 2021. During that same time period, the number of employees in the bureaucracy grew by 21%. We can't afford to freeze the bureaucracy at the current levels like the NDP is suggesting. We need to cut the bureaucracy because we can't afford it. A more effective bureaucracy means more money in your pockets and less red tape bogging down your business. All of this isn't just unsustainable for our province, it's unacceptable. And folks, we don't need to accept it because we can choose a different path. We can choose that path to prosperity. But to do it, to bring our beautiful province back on that path to prosperity, we need three simple things. We need lower taxes, we need less wasteful spending, and we need a more accountable government. Now, the first is lower taxes. High taxes, they hurt families and they hurt local businesses. And this government's tax take is growing far faster than any of us can afford. Right now, British Columbians pay the highest gas taxes in Canada. On a minivan fill-up, drivers in Vancouver are paying $52 in taxes alone. The taxes in that same fill-up across the border in Alberta are just $31. For most families, the carbon tax on natural gas used for home heating costs more than the natural gas itself. There is no reason we should be punishing families for heating their homes when the wild West Coast winds are howling. When the carbon tax makes food on store shelves more expensive because it's more expensive to transport that food, you don't stop eating. You're only forced to spend more and more money. Now, we have the oldest carbon tax in North America. It was brought back way in 2008, and at the time, the BC Liberals bent over backwards, promising British Columbians that it would reduce our emissions by 33% between 2007 and 2020. Now, of course that didn't happen. Of course it didn't reduce our emissions. You can't tax away the need to heat your home in Prince George in the winter. Now, for those of you who haven't been to Prince George, it gets so cold there in the winter that when cabinet ministers are in town, they have their hands in their own pockets for a change. Now, of course, the carbon tax didn't reduce our emissions by 33%. In fact, today we are emitting more greenhouse gases than when the carbon tax was introduced. You can't tax away the need to drive your kids to school or drive yourself to work. You can't tax away the need to heat your home in the winter. The carbon tax just makes life more expensive for British Columbians and drives investments south of the border. It's not just gas taxes that have made life unaffordable for British Columbians. The BC government has hiked taxes on everything from second-hand cars to family cottages, from freedom of information requests to Airbnbs. Brand new taxes like the employer health tax punish small businesses for expanding and creating new, well-paying jobs in communities across our province. And that has real consequences. 203 businesses in BC declared bankruptcy in 2024. The year before that, it was 179 businesses, and the year before that, 105. That means business bankruptcies have nearly doubled in the past 3 years alone. We shouldn't be punishing businesses for creating jobs in our communities, and we shouldn't be chasing away investments with job-killing taxes. If our economy is going to grow, if families are going to have more money in their pockets, then British Columbians need tax cuts. But we can't fund those tax cuts through even more reckless and wasteful spending. The second thing we need to get back on the path to prosperity is to cut wasteful spending from this government. There's no better place to start than with the Crown corporations. A government cannot control the economy without controlling the people, so the government needs to get out of the business of doing business. BC taxpayers should own a state-owned media company, the Knowledge Network, which costs taxpayers $6.6 million a year, to produce content like Only in Nelson, which asks, and I quote, "Can this ultra-liberal, hippie, pot-producing oasis deal with an encroaching right-wing North American conservative agenda? Well, I think a right-wing conservative agenda should stop taxpayers paying for government propaganda." Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba have all ditched the dead weight of a state broadcaster, and British Columbia must too. The NBC Investment Corporation was given a $500 million handout to shell out corporate welfare. It receives an additional $6.9 million top-up from the government every single year. Bureaucrats shouldn't be role-playing as the Wolf of Wall Street. They certainly shouldn't be using your tax dollars to do it. Innovate BC takes about $17 million every year to dole out even more corporate welfare. 54% of recipient organizations had a DEI focus. PowerX is a subsidiary of BC Hydro, and its CEO was paid $1.6 million in 2023. Think about that for a minute. A single Crown Corporation executive took home as much money as the total provincial tax bill of 300 families making $100,000 a year. The entire provincial tax bill for a town the size of Tassus is going towards paying this one bureaucrat. When food banks across our province are seeing record-breaking demand, why, oh why, are we paying one bureaucrat $1.6 million? Taxpayers shouldn't own a stadium and convention center in downtown Vancouver. We should sell Pavilion Corps' capital assets. BC Place and the Vancouver Convention Center are worth $948 million. That is almost $1 billion that could go towards cutting taxes for your family or small businesses. That is nearly $1 billion that could go towards keeping emergency rooms open or hiring the police we need to keep our streets safe. BC also shouldn't be paying to host FIFA Soccer World Cup in that stadium. Taxpayers shouldn't be on the hook to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to host just a handful of international soccer games. The FIFA World Cup in 2026 will cost taxpayers $581 million to host just 7 of the tournament's 104 games. That means we will be spending $1 million for every minute of regular playtime. That money we're spending on FIFA could pay the salaries of 855 teachers for a decade, build 17 schools, or cut taxes for families and small businesses. Bureaucrats, like the Premier's former Chief of Staff, Matt Smith, shouldn't be spending tens of thousands of dollars on the taxpayer dime for helicopter travel when the ferry or the freeway would work for free. Government does nothing as well or as economically as the private sector of this economy, so it must get out of the business of doing business. But friends, more than anything, British Columbians need a government that's accountable to taxpayers, not to big unions or to political insiders, but to the normal people who are paying the bills. But unfortunately, David Eby has let us down. British Columbia brought in a new tax when journalists and taxpayers file Freedom of Information requests. To give you just one example, I requested documents that show how much the University of British Columbia paid out in bonuses, and I was told I would have to pay a $28,000 fee to see those records. If democracy dies in darkness, then this government has thrown our access to information rights down a black hole by hiding them behind a paywall. This provincial government is, I quote, systematically failing to abide by the law when it comes to Freedom of Information requests, according to our former Information Commissioner. You can't have an accountable government if it's cloaked in secrecy. We need to end the secrecy. We need to end the Freedom of Information tax. We also need to make sure our cities and regional districts are accountable to taxpayers. But this government made that harder too. They eliminated the Auditor General for local governments, which was a watchdog for municipalities and regional districts. Back in 2020, the NDP axed that office, saying the municipalities didn't want the extra oversight. Friends, that's like retiring the farm dog because the fox doesn't want him guarding the chicken coop anymore. And we are paying for that. As a result, we have projects like the North Shore Wastewater Treatment Plant coming in $3 billion over budget and a decade behind schedule. We need a provincial government that will show leadership, a provincial government that will bring back the Auditor General for local governments. Thank you. And if we're going to solve the sky-high taxes and wasteful spending, we need an accountable government. But friends, this is not a partisan problem. They tell us that we need to choose between left and right. But friends, there is no such thing. There is only right or wrong, up or down, prosperity or poverty. We need to make the right decisions, even if those are hard decisions. We're at a crossroads in beautiful British Columbia. We can keep letting the politicians and bureaucrats in Victoria pick our pockets, or we can choose a different path. We can choose lower taxes, less wasteful spending, and a more accountable government. But my fellow British Columbians, the choice is yours. Thank you so much.